Sarhad Samvad, Season 2. Join us as we explore all kinds of borders across the world.
A very good morning, Elizabeth, and thanks for accepting our request to be a part of this Sarhad Samvad, which means border talks. We all know your great work on border studies, on border walls, and which has not only added a lot of literature, but inspired a number of scholars all over the world to look border differently because you brought the concept of border walls. And very powerfully, you also explained that even in the age of globalization, the walls that we thought are not going anywhere. In fact, many walls have actually came up during the time when we thought it's a borderless world. So I would like to start my first question from your work itself, and that is, how do you think that we know that we are in different times, but a couple of years back we were celebrating globalization like anything. So why do you feel that there are walls in the age of globalization? What is your understanding about it?
Thank you very much, Dhananjay. It is a super interesting question. And it is indeed where my work started. Actually, I was living in the US and seeing all those public contracting from Saudi Arabia, Israel, and it was starting in the US for um, big big contracts to build border walls, which seemed a bit odd, indeed, and because we were in a time of globalization and borderless world. Um, and what was interesting enough is when we started trying to put the data together, it seemed like at the time, it was the beginning of the century, it seemed at the time like a global phenomenon. We could see that there were walls being built everywhere. So if we're looking at that as a global phenomenon, what did it signal? It was a few years after 9/11, so we assumed it was the trigger was 9/11. But as we were digging into the data and seeing the figures add up, it didn't make sense because the trend started before 9/11. So we had to walk back the hypothesis in a way and look at border walls, maybe, and 9/11 not as a trigger, but solely as an accelerator, which meant that there was another explanation. So we got into the figures, into the data, looked at this again, and it seemed like it was actually the limitations or the fundamentals of globalization in a way. Borders are key to globalization. And as you said, in a borderless world, in globalization, the key word is borderless, but still borders. So we have, in a way, in assuming mostly in the EU and within NAFTA that the world was borderless, we assumed that it would be borders all had the same value all across the world, which wasn't the case. So it's actually borders are consubstantial to globalization. Hence, the reaction to globalization was in some places to strengthen borders to signal maybe a need for more state sovereignty as the sovereignty was fading in a way. So yeah, that's how we kind of pieced things together and realized that it was first a global phenomenon, it was obvious, but then that it was even consubstantial to a certain way of making globalization. I don't hear you.
Thank you. And we are in an interesting time, Elizabeth, because you know, from walls, there are different kinds of wall that is also in your writings. You sometimes refers to digital borders. What is digital borders? Because although we, as a border studies scholars, we talk about it, but can you explain a little bit for our audiences, like what is this digital borders and how this is becoming so important in the entire discourse of borders in the contemporary world?
Yeah, it's interesting because we cannot today simplify or reduce the idea of a wall to physical wall. Of course, those walls are key. There are more than 86 of them in the world being built, more actually, probably. But what we see is that there may be a physical wall, but there are always other layers. And one of them is indeed digital. And it can take the form of visa processing from a distance. It can also be biometrics that will limit somebody in his capacity to cross the border. It can also be, one of those applications we've seen being used at the US-Mexico border, where migrants have to show up within the borderlands to be able to register on CBP1 on an app in order to identify themselves. And then they may be allowed to cross at some point after waiting a long time in Mexico. So and even when they are entitled to claim asylum. So digital walls actually have largely been targeting pre-clearance. They are trying to, in a way, make sure that when people show up at the border, they will be already screened. And that has huge implications as we are more and more using apps that have been designed by in a certain way, and an AI that relies on what it has been fed. And it has shown in some cases that some of those databases and some of those applications were actually filtering out some dark colored people because it didn't recognize them or couldn't identify them because AI was being fed, predominantly white people's pictures or data. So it's kind of interesting to see how it reproduces violence, inequalities, and even racism.
Thank you. I think a very important point. Do you think that this is a kind of a new kind of a walls, a digital wall that is now coming up in and around world? Can we also see this kind of technology as walls? Elizabeth, what is your take on this?
Absolutely. And they actually sometimes they are superimposing over physical barriers and physical walls. And when there is a physical wall, usually there is something else on top. But we also see in some cases borders that are solely about digital. COVID actually has been one of the main triggers because suddenly there was a need to close border or filter people out. And one way to do things was digital, but it was also a time where populations were more keen to accept an increased control and less prone to contest this evolution. So now we are caught in a way with a digitalization of the border, which is fast growing, and that maybe for which we haven't defined enough imputability and capacity to control, I think, on one side, while on the other side, physical walls are still being built. So there will certainly be a need in future studies to literally map out those superimposition of different types of borders and how they will more and more filter people and more people. So we will be less and less mobile in a way due to that.
Thank you. This is really important, as you said, that we need to map like how this is being used. This is very important and something a future research agenda for all of us. Uh, uh, and from this, I really wanted to understand. You know, we as a student of border studies, we 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 know that how the humanity as such has been benefited by people, by the mobility of people. But nowadays, what we have witnessing all over the world, and this is a phenomena, and it's no more or no longer only a phenomena of the global north. We also see in the global south there is a lot of restrictions coming up on the mobility. They don't want immigrants. They don't want people to enter your borders. Why this kind of anxiety on immigration? Why this is becoming such a political issues in every country? Because there's a lot of, I think, support also somehow for political parties who want a very strict, rigid border controls. So why this kind of new, debate on mobility, on immigrations?
Some say that we have entered an era of de-globalization, and because of that crispation around borders and migrations. And that may well be true. Maybe we've reached the end of an era, and maybe the readjustment of the global order goes along with that redefinition of sovereignty and borders. Um, this being said, it's also the fact that as we are facing more and more crises, the poly-crisis, which we talk a lot about, of course, being the cumulative effect of climate crisis, democratic crisis, and the conflicts that we see, the growing tensions in the world, some of them largely manufactured by the US. Um, what 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 we in those cases, migrants are an easy target. It's easy to point out to a group of people that come from outside. It's something that is as old as the world, but in an era of social media, in an era where threats and crises have a global denomination. It is more and more. It's easy to just point out, close the border. It is like the wall in a way. It's something that you can show. It's something that you can um, promote, whether in a populist, electoralist platform, and at the same time, it's an object, the wall, or a group as a target that you can show off to show that you've been doing something. We've seen Trump signing the wall. We've seen Trump claiming that he actually closed the border, which is not, it's not closed, but people are not coming. So it's actually working. And that's probably in terms of image, in terms of electoralist discourses, works really well. It's easy. It's costly in the long term, but in the short term, it seems like something very easy to achieve. On the other hand, it will, as I said, become very costly economically speaking to limit immigration. We are seeing taking a toll here in North America because we are limiting immigration. And I think the one thing we border scholars need to improve is the how to communicate the fact that it is actually a burden to cut ourselves from the world, that it will be costly economically in the long run. And that's probably where we have to improve.
Thank you. This brings me to the next question. You just mentioned about North America. We are coming from global south. Our understanding about borders is a little different from the your understanding of borders from where I'm talking of the location. Uh,
Oui.
do you think that is there a possibility? And I know that you have a lot of interest in promoting border studies in global south. You are personally engaged in some of these projects. So why do you think that there is a need for much more engagement between in border studies between global north and global south? Why this is so important, according to you?
I think it is essential. It's as if we had reached a peak that we could see as a dead end in regular border studies. Let's put it that way. Even critical border studies is now turning to post-human border studies. So we can see that there is a need to look for other avenues of thinking. And I think what is coming from the global south, the understanding of the border, even the very epistemology of the border is something that can be renewed and actually has to be renewed. And the only avenue I see is by dialoguing, but really a real dialogue between global south and the perspective, and which can be very diverse. So even here I'm making kind of a generalization, but another perspective or other perspectives in a dialogue. And I think that's maybe the thing. It needs to be what we see in northern universities, let's say, is global south as a token. So we will be bringing scholars, having discussions, but still remaining on the same spot, intellectually speaking. So I think there is a need for us, global north, to acknowledge the fact that there are limitations in the way we think and that we need to incorporate new methodologies and even epistemologies. And that's where I think the dialogue you and I have been having and others is absolutely essential. But it will take a great deal of work to be able to achieve what needs to be a real dialogue, methodologically speaking, ontologically speaking. So we need to push the walls and the borders of our knowledge, definitely. So we still have a lot of work to do, you and I.
Yeah, of course, certainly, and a lot to contribute to the border studies from these two perspectives. Uh, uh, this brings me to the last question. I know it's a start of the day for you, so I don't want to hold you for long. The last question, and this is, sometimes this comes to my mind, and also during different interactions with the students, etc. A lot of emphasis there on a feminist understanding of the borders. you know uh, and sometimes the students ask this question, like, what is the difference? How can a man and a woman see differently the borders? What is this difference? It's the same thing, uh, and
Yeah.
I'm very sure that this is a question for many of our viewers as well, like, what is this border? This border is same for, if you are traveling from a global south, you're a male, you face the same kind of restrictions as there is a woman. So what's such a big deal about this? So can you explain it?
Yes, there are two levels, actually, two ways to answer to answer your questions, which is very interesting. And actually, we were discussing that yesterday with my students. So um, it is, first of all, as a woman, and I see that even as a researcher, when I am at a border, being a woman means that I will be addressed differently. And in some cases, I could say that it's empowering because I'm as a female researcher, as a mother. I remember going to the border with my baby. There were many things, many places where I was not seen as a threat. So it has been an asset sometimes. On the other hand, we've interviewed a lot of migrants, women who knew that they would be like, it wasn't a question of if, but when they were going to be sexually assaulted on their way from Central America to the US border. And women do take a toll in different ways. They often carry their kids around. Men do too, and I'm not saying they're not, but sometimes it changes the relations in the migration. That's one thing as a person. But feminist approaches of border studies are a tad different in a way. What we're looking at is intersectionality. So how you may, let's say, your color, your appearances, your visa, your passport, your documents, all of this can coagulate to make you stronger or more vulnerable as you go through the border. Intersectionality is a concept that comes from Black feminism, where Black women, that's those who started the thinking, were saying that, being Black, being a woman, maybe having another sexual orientation or what have you, would not only accumulate but inflate as they were adding. So from that, feminist perspectives are looking into bodies. How do you carry the border in your body? But it also connects with indigenous studies where they say that, it's not the border that crossed us. We didn't cross the border, it's the border that crossed us. And actually, we still carry the border in our bodies. Somebody of color in the US today is a border by him or herself, because it will be a target from ICE, the police that is now arresting and deporting. So feminist perspectives are looking into bodies specifically, and it was one of the starting point of critical border studies. So looking at how individualized, pixelized became the border as we were powering through the 21st century. COVID was, a matter that was super useful when we were looking at feminist perspective, because suddenly you being vaccinated or not vaccinated, being young or old, etc., you were able or not to cross a border because you could show that your body was actually clear of or prone of viruses. And that per se, that reading of your body as a border is a feminist approach. So when we say feminist perspective on the border, it can be, yes, about how a man and a woman may cross borders differently, but it's also a methodology, even more than looking into women.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm very sure, very interesting engagement, dialogue, and some very interesting answers. Uh, I'm sure many will benefit from this. So thank you very much for taking out time from your very busy schedule. I know it's a start of a day for you. So I'll stop my interview here. Thank you very much for speaking to Sarhad Samvad.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.